Right, we have a treat for you. Next week, we are having a 2-hour discussion about Brexit. But right now, we're having a half-an-hour discussion about some aspects that touch on all of the things we're going to be talking about next week. And I'm delighted to welcome Eleni and Alison to the studio. Thank you so much for coming. We have what I think is the most interesting aspect, in particular right now, where we're looking at European identity and citizenship. And national identity and how we perceive it. A really, really topical, hot topic, and one that when we had our referendum discussion in July, in fact, last year about, was something that people were really interested in talking about to the chat. So I'm hoping that there'll be a lot of discussion in the chat. Do put your views and your questions, etc. in that, and we will feed those and integrate those into our discussion. But we've got some widgets for you that we'd like you to have a think about. Now, these are the interactive tools, and you can select on them and click what applies to you. So we've got one about migration benefiting the economy, and this is a scale. So from not very far to too far, although migration has benefited the economy, has it gone too far now? So we'd like you to put your views there. Also, from not possible to possible, is it possible to be British and European? And the question, if you're a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? And of course, lots of questions and discussion in the chat. If you're in the Watch and Engage, you'll be able to enjoy all of that. If you're in the live stream only, come into the Watch and Engage from the Student Hub Live website, studenthub.kmi.open.ac.uk. And you can also use the hashtag StudentHubLive16 and our email, studenthub@open.ac.uk. So we have a very broad topic, and we have representatives from economics and psychology here to talk about identity. National identity is such a key thing, and we were talking before about the extent to which we could be considered both European and British. How important do you think this whole thing is right now?
Can I start?
Yeah. Please.
I think it is quite important, thinking about Brexit and the whole discussion about the referendum and what should happen next. I think a key, kind of a central issue is whether Britishness, the idea of what it means to be British, is part of European, and whether British identity encapsulates an idea of Europeanness within it or not. So I think that was a big discussion before the referendum vote.
I think some of the statistical analysis as well that's been done of surveys since the vote has been quite interesting, looking at how people identify themselves. And a high proportion of the Leave voters identify themselves either as English and British, or English, mainly English and British, whereas the Remain voters tended to vote either British or European. So they saw themselves with this dual British-European nationality, whereas the Leave voters saw themselves as a dual English-British, not a European identity. So clearly there is something going on as to how people identify themselves in terms of their own nationality and identity. So I think it is key to what's happening. Absolutely.
You talk about the statistics, and I'd like to see the results of the first question that we asked people, which was about whether it's possible to be British and European, and see what people thought about that. Because sometimes we can say, well, yes, of course it is possible to be both, but it's quite a nuanced distinction. There's a lot going on, as you say, Alison, within those identity constructs. And also, we're using language and statistics and all of these parameters to look at things that maybe aren't necessarily what we're saying they are.
I think it's true. I think identity is a very complex. I mean, Eleni's more of an expert on identity, but it's a very complex thing and a very subjective concept as well. So how one person identifies as English is different to how another person would identify that term.
Let's see what people said at home. So we'll have the results of this first widget here that we asked you about. So a lot of people are saying that it's very possible to be both British and European, with a few people saying sort of in the middle. So it's really sort of seen as very much in agreement with that statement. What might an interpretation of that be?
I think, as Alison just said, I think it's a very contextualized issue, identity. So it's really hard to interpret those. I mean, you can say that people, yes, do think that there is kind of identity, European British identity can be combined, but the question is how and to what extent. And I think we perhaps need more nuanced, more qualitative measures to assess what people actually mean when they say British and what they mean when they say European. So for a person who voted Remain and for a person who voted Leave, perhaps what it means to be European may be very, very different things, and what it means to be British may be very, very different things as well. So I think we really need to kind of explore in more depth those meanings around those identities.
I agree. It's very easy to, as it was to ask people to tick a box, yes, no, Leave, Remain. It's very easy to say, are you British, are you European? But actually getting what that actually means in practice. What does it mean to be British? What does it mean to be European? That is something much, much more complex and much more contextual and may differ geographically across Britain. Certainly the four nations within Britain, it will differ what British identity actually means to people.
And to pick up the points you've both made about, what does this mean? And Alison, you'd mentioned that sometimes we were using statistics. We're using statistics to make interpretations of what people mean, but also we're using those then as stereotypes about, I think you mentioned, the Remainers, and we're categorising people by the way that they voted. So in addition to, I guess, putting identity markers in terms of the way that people are choosing to be, we're also externalising those to some extent, aren't we?
Absolutely, and that's a big issue in social science research, the way that we perhaps reconstruct and rehearse existing social categories. But I guess the answer is you have to be reflective about the way that we use those categories and kind of think a little bit about our own assumptions when we are using them. Yeah.
There's been quite a lot talked about the Leave voters being racist, being working class, being sort of white men, and sort of stereotyping them. And actually, it's much more complex than that. There's a whole diversity of people who voted for Leave, and there has been some research, but it hasn't really been that nuanced. And it has served almost to reinforce that stereotype view that it's all about immigration and Leavers are racists in some way. I don't think the press has been very helpful in that process. They were instrumental in fueling the anti-immigration vote in the first place, and I think subsequently they've reinforced that it's all about immigration.
It's an interesting idea. We'd mentioned that you were both from various disciplines, and so from a psychology and an economics perspective, you're both sort of approaching this using different methods and different ways of looking at things and making different interpretations. And, I think we'd all agree that stereotyping isn't necessarily useful or helpful, but to some extent there has been this categorisation of this demographic information that is used to make assumptions. And, from a statistical perspective, that's done for a reason. And I guess the question then is, how useful is this, and what do we do with it if it is something that is happening?
I think it is useful, and there's data that suggests that a high proportion of the Leave voters were from lower income households. A high proportion were in rented accommodation. They stated that they were just about managing or not managing, that things were worse for them than for other people. So that there is a sort of some kind of sense that for some of those people that there is something going on. But what statistical and broad information like that doesn't tell us is some of the kind of the reasons why they feel like that and what the reality is, because a lot of the Leave voters who may have said it's about immigration and we want to take control and reduce immigration came from communities that had very low proportions of migrant people in there. So, for example, in the Welsh Valleys, they voted Leave, but they didn't have some of the issues that some of the other communities in England that had high proportions of migrant workers had. But they still have the same demographic, and so they're stereotyped in the same pot. But actually the issues must be different because they differ fundamentally.
Let's see what our students said. So we've had a look, sort of collating around the middle. Although migration has benefited the economy, very, very spread set of answers here, with some people saying not far at all, some saying too far, and quite a lot in the middle. So a nice normal distribution curve going on there. I mean, we were talking when we were preparing for this session about national identity and what might a national identity be, and how that might change over time, and it's obviously very contextual. We were talking about ideas about class, which touch on what you were saying, Alison, and what it is to be British. And just thinking about, grouping people together and how we use these distinctions, is something like class and, migration useful ways of looking at the them-us divide when we're looking at identity? Are we collecting around our in-group desire to be, with like-minded people?
I think that's a very good point, actually. Yeah, I mean, and there is a value in using those categorizations and kind of those social groups, like social class, or like, I don't remember what was your other example. But yes, in groups and out groups. Yeah. But the real issue for me as a social psychologist, I guess, is to look at the intersections of categories. So you can't just look at class without looking at race or ethnicity or gender. So being, for example, I don't know, a poor white working man or like a middle-class black woman may be quite different experiences. So we need to look at those intersections of social categories and and social groups, actually, and kind of avoid those crude dichotomies between the working classes and the middle classes, or the poor and the rich, or, and all those kinds of things, yeah.
I think those that serves to polarize people when you start creating those in-out categories, and rich, poor. I think it's quite divisive to do that.
So on one extent, we're using a lot of these statistics, and that's happening. But actually, what we're saying really is that there are a lot more complex issues, and some of these are about our desire to be British and also part of Europe. And we were asking people whether they think you can be both, and also this idea about a cosmopolitan sort of culture. We aspire to integrate a lot within Europe, but then also there is this desire for people to want to support their national identity as well. Are these two ideas compatible in any sense?
I think so. I think that's. We would call that a dilemma, perhaps, in some of the social psychology theorizing about this. I think people are not just cosmopolitans or nationalists. I think people can understand kind of both sides of the debate, and they can relate to both sides of the debate. And an example is, for instance, in the referendum campaigning, that the Brexit campaigning was campaigning for a global Britain outside of European Union. So you had a seemingly nationalistic argument, but embedded within a kind of a globalist framework, if you know what I mean. So again, I'm going to say this again, things are much more complex. I don't think it's an either-or distinction. I think it's a both-and distinction.
Yeah. If you look at Scotland, they have a very strong Scottish identity, but they also have this desire to remain in Europe and to be cosmopolitan. So it's perfectly possible for the two to coexist. And I think if you're confident in your identity, then it's much easier to be open to other identities. You don't see them as a challenge. And maybe that's because English nationalism is fairly new as a phenomena. Perhaps it feels that it's being challenged by the presence of migrants. I don't know what you think as a social psychologist.
Oh wow! I think anti-immigration sentiments are also kind of manipulated politically. So it's not just what people think or what people feel, but also the context in which those ideas are developed and the kind of political purposes that they serve. So we need to be attuned to the politics of those discourses.
Yeah. There was, we're having a whole discussion about the impact internally in the UK and the way that the various nations are going to be dealing with this. I believe similar to what you're saying about Scotland with Northern Ireland, but the Welsh identity is quite similar to the English one. So is there this sort of split, I guess, within the United Kingdom in terms of identity, in the way that we perceive a national identity?
Do you want to?
I would say yes, that would be my immediate.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure what the difference between English and Welsh identity is. Welsh people tend to identify themselves as Welsh and British. They don't identify as English, obviously, but they do identify as British as well as Welsh, whereas the Scottish tend to either be British or Scottish. They don't tend to identify as dual. So there's obviously something with England and Wales that's quite similar. That is different to Scotland.
I guess have certain legal things in common, etc.
That's right,
so that might hold. I mean, I live in Wales, and the Welsh have a very strong national identity in certain parts in particular, but they also voted to leave. So it's not always quite as clear cut, is it? HJ and Sophie, what are people talking about on the hot desk? And are there any thoughts that have come through in terms of things like migration and class and the various sorts of categories that we've been using to try and look through this lens at identity?
I think some interesting comments have come about the ideas around identity. So Ben said, to what extent can we determine for ourselves what role a national identity plays in our lives, which I think is something interesting to think about. And Chantal as well said she volunteers teaching English and finds that some people identify themselves as British as well as their original nationality, and others just use their original nationality. So we've been thinking in the chat about how we put certain characteristics on different nationalities. So we view different nationalities in different ways, and whether that changes how we think about our own nationalities. And Stuart says, am I Scottish? Am I British? Am I European? Am I just a resident of planet Earth? Who knows?
There's this whole idea when we look at identity, isn't there, about, singular identities, multiple identities, fluid and fixed, and there are all sorts of debates and discussions around identity. But it does, this whole question about how can we, and, what are we doing? Is this identity enacted on us, with the whole idea of stereotyping, how much choice we have in that whole discussion, and for what purpose this identity is serving?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think identity it feels very, very personal and very subjective because it's who we are, right? So it feels, very subjective. But at the same time, we also feel that we don't have too much power in defining what it means. So, identity is a social construct. People collectively construct it. And that's what makes it a very contextualized concept. So I would say in response to that first question that it is a kind of an interesting dynamic interplay between having individual agency in shaping what it means for you, for example, to be British, and kind of being restricted by discourses that circulate about what it means to be British, which you don't necessarily have too much power on.
What about the impact, Alison, in terms of thinking about how much choice we have in this matter, in terms of some of these austerity measures and the impact of the economy on our identity, how much power we have really when there's this issue of us being British or being, citizens of the world or however we're wanting to construct ourselves, and then this whole issue of a government sort of having a role in that formation of identity? So the austerity measures really, and the impact that things like that would have on how we might feel about ourselves as British.
I mean, there's a lot of evidence that suggests, not just in Britain but across Europe itself, that the times of austerity have resulted in a rise in far-right parties in particular. But generally, when the economy is suffering, you get extreme groups, either the right or the left, emerging. And what seems to be happening in Europe and in Britain is that the right and nationalistic parties seem to be coming to the fore, and they're feeding into that feeling of threat that outsiders pose to jobs, to access to welfare, and that is feeding the far right and the rise of those groups. And of course, the media are playing their part in sort of feeding the populist debates around that. So, and I think it's very dangerous what's happening. I mean, we see in France the elections. Yeah. Where she doesn't say she's National Front anymore, but Marie Le Pen could quite possibly get elected, and she is quite far right.
I mean, is this just, a European thing, or even, when thinking about the United States and the wall and, the various things, is this a sign of the times and a sign of things that are wider than just Europe and the UK?
I think it is, and whenever we have periods of austerity and economic crisis, you do see these groups emerging, across the world. And it is a response to threat and trying to protect what few resources we have from outsiders. So, you see stuff like Trump building a wall, to keep the Mexicans out and trying to protect American jobs. And we're seeing the same sorts of discourses throughout politics. So I think it's a worldwide problem.
And of course, these austerity measures have had massive political implications in the past, after periods of Great Depression, etc. But I guess, this sort of links to the point, Eleni, you were saying before about how some of these statements are used for political reasons and how nationality can be sometimes a factor that is used by governments to try and deliver on certain things.
Absolutely, yeah. National identity is primarily a politicized identity. So yes, political movements, governments, they might kind of construct it in different ways to pursue their own aims. So I think this is happening, for example, now in Britain with the kind of post-Brexit debates and whether we should leave the single market or stay in the single market and so on. And you can see that at the very core of those discussions is what is our vision for Britain and what is our vision for what it means to be a British citizen. So yeah, I think it's very, very, very important. Yeah.
HJ and Sophie, let's take a quick trip to the hot desk and see what other thoughts students at home have got.
I think, one of the things that we're interested in is about how, as you said, class seems to be more of a theme emerging in politics, and there seems to be a lot more strong emphasis. And you mentioned the elections in France, and Le Pen did extremely well in the poorer working class areas, whereas Mélenchon did a lot better in the rich metropolitan areas like Paris and Bordeaux, but this is me getting excited and just thinking about it.
We had Sylvia has been on, and she's Canadian, and her mother was Italian, and her father was born in the UK. So she identifies as a Canadian. So it's just interesting how people can come from all different places, and their parents can come from two different places. You can still identify as somewhere else, And I think that's quite nice. It's fluid in that way, which is nice that people can sort of put themselves where they want to be, so to speak. But yeah, everyone seems to be having a really good time at the moment. We've just convinced Marion to go to Venice, so. Marion, I think you should do it. Go to Venice for the first time ever abroad. I think you should do it and keep us updated.
Yes.
Excellent. I wanted to pick up on some of the points that we were talking before about immigration, and in particular when, we may be feeling under this economic threat, that we react in certain ways. And we were talking a little bit earlier about how, we asked the audience as well about the extent to which they thought immigration has benefited the economy, but has it gone, too far right now? So how has this become an important dialogue in the whole debate about Brexit? And Alison, you were mentioning that, there is a lot of evidence to support that immigration is a very, very good and positive thing, both for the economy and for a national identity. But it has been quite a main centre of the argument in terms of the Leave campaigners.
It has, and they kind of have denied those economic benefits that immigration has brought to this country. And what they focused on is almost those cultural threats that immigration poses to individuals. So I think the media has been very clever in the way they've presented the Leave argument. So they almost ignored the economic arguments when the Remainers focused on the economic arguments and how immigration had benefited and created jobs and created wealth, and people ignored all of that and looked at those sort of cultural threats and looked more at that argument for immigration than the economic ones. But it is a fact that we have benefited from economic immigration, and there are huge problems that could emerge in particular sectors if we get rid of the free movement of labour. Agriculture's one, and at the other scale, the NHS could suffer if we stop having migrant workers. So, I don't think people appreciate how much we actually rely on immigration.
So there's the sort of, I guess, economic aspect, but Eleni, in terms of the cultural aspect, does immigration add to this cosmopolitan identity that we often aspire to? Does it conflict with a national identity, or is it just something in the middle that isn't really having an impact on either?
I think it does have an impact, and I think British identity is enriched by multiculturalism, by diversity, and by cosmopolitan values. And if you ask people, that's one of the first things that they say about Britishness. One of the most positive things about it is very inclusive, and it is built on Britain is built on immigration, and British identity is built on kind of influences from migrants and from the former colonies. So I think it's essential that we acknowledge that and we respect that and nurture that as much as we can, really. So it is both an economic and a cultural cultural kind of issue. Absolutely.
But multiculturalism as a concept has declined in popularity. I mean, in the 1980s, the whole thing was about multiculturalism and welcoming people and respecting their values and including them. And now that sort of assimilation model is quite different. Since 9/11, I think that was the point, and the rise of Muslim fundamentalism, that there's now a sort of kickback against multiculturalism, and it's almost like a bad word now, whereas it used to be a positive word, and now people are thinking, no, we don't want multiculturalism. So things have changed.
So again, maybe thinking about these stereotypical groups. So it might be okay for that lot, but not necessarily that lot. So our ideas about things are changing. Also, this idea about us doing things or responding to surveys or saying certain things that we don't necessarily mean or hold true in terms of what we actually want. And I think the point that you both made earlier about how we conceptualise and categorise certain things, we might say multiculturalism is a good thing. You couldn't really sort of say it wasn't and be politically correct. And I think a lot of people do. But, as you were saying, Eleni, before, these constructs in our minds about what it means to be within that category are very much unexpressed and also unexplored.
Unexplored for sure, I think, to their full extent. Multiculturalism is a good example because for some people it means extreme political correctness or something quite negative. And for some other people it means cultural richness. And then you can see again the politics of constructing identities and concepts, because multiculturalism can be mobilized for very different political purposes. So it was mobilized by Tony Blair to serve very different political purposes at a very different time of this for this country, compared to a recent kind of David Cameron and Theresa May governments. Yeah.
Do you think, in light of the election, that this whole idea about national identity will grow of more importance or less importance, bearing in mind all of these other issues that are so important in the overall Brexit debate?
I think it's getting more and more important. I think it's a time now where national identity is being problematized, is being discussed, is being reflected upon. So now is our chance to really reshape it, reconstruct it in a way that we think suits us and our groups and our and our interests and our affiliations. So really it's a time when it's all up in the air in a way. So it's our chance to shape it in a way that we think is best.
A more negative perspective.
Bring the economists in.
I think Theresa May will cynically use national identity and nationalism to manipulate people to vote Conservative. And I think all those threats about immigration and what it poses to being British, I think they will all emerge and be aired. So I think that whole concept will be quite central to the election.
It's very dichotomous, isn't it? Because on one hand we're saying we need to pull together, we need some sort of national identity, and then everyone's going, yeah, but I can have 8 identities, I can be this, this and this. And there's this, sort of unbalance really between wanting one thing but also recognising that maybe isn't a reality or possibility or even an aspiration.
I think we need to think about cosmopolitanism not in a kind of cosmopolitan identities and affiliation, not as something that's abstract and exists kind of above everything else, but as something that is rooted and local as well. So we need to think about, again, not the binary between kind of localism and cosmopolitanism, but rather how people can relate to particular identities, local identities, as well as being open to the world and open to diversity. Yeah.
I still think the Conservative government will mark this.
On that bombshell, I will thank you both very much for being such lively guests, and how interesting it is to take two different perspectives and really different ways of looking at things. Identity, I think, is one of those things we can never quite conclude with, but you know, this whole idea about fixed and multiple identities is something that will permeate the discussions that we have in the various sectors next week when we take a good hard look at the Brexit events that are going to be unfolding. So Eleni and Alison, thank you so much for coming along today. That's been great. Well, I hope that's given you a lot of food for thought, because on the 3rd of May, from 10 until 12, we are going to be having a discussion about Brexit with Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. That's available and open to anybody who would like to access. So I hope to see you there. That afternoon as well, we're going to have an Open Justice event from the Open University Law School. So that will be very interesting to many of you as well. You can check that all out on the website. But before I tell you how to keep in touch with us and what to do, I'd just like to take a quick trip to the hot desk to see what Sophie and HJ have to say in summary.
Yes, it's been a really good session. I've really missed it. It's nice to be back. Just want to end on a comment from Chantel. She says that people feel that British identity is being threatened by immigration, but forget that it was originally created by immigration when we were invaded in the past, which I quite like. I like that thought of British identity being everyone involved. So that sums things up quite well. Thanks, Chantel.
Yes, but we've had lots of great conversation today, and we've really enjoyed it. We've learned lots of new study skills, which I'm very happy about. So hopefully my assignment won't go too badly. If there's anything we missed, and I know some of you will be emailing us, just email studenthub@open.ac.uk. But I think we got lots of great discussion here as a primer for next week. So we'll all be thinking about that until then.
Next week, how they get on with all the tips, how you get on with your essay plans, how you're getting on with your EMAs. So hopefully we'll speak to you next week and catch up with everyone then.
Thank you both. You've been absolutely fantastic. And thank you at home for all of your contributions in the chat. We've certainly covered a lot today. What have we done? My goodness, we've been having a look at essay writing. We've been having a look at all of that wonderful advice Georgina and Matt gave us for, in particular, the Level 1 students who have EMAs, but also looking at exam advice as well. So those were really good sessions you can watch on Catch Up if you've missed them. We then took a look at problem solving with David's 3W approach, and then the employabilities tool that you can access, anybody can access. And then John Quill showed us some other additional ways that you could look at supporting your OU study with careers aspects and employability links that are all available on OpenLearn, on the MOOCs, and on your qualifications and module websites. So thank you very much for coming along today. As I said, we're back on the 3rd of May now. If you would like to be in touch with us, you can subscribe to our email newsletter, and then we'll tell you when events are on. You can go back to the website studenthub.kmi.open.ac.uk. Give us your email address and then we'll let you know when the next events are on. And as I said also, we're going to be doing a special careers session on the 16th of May, and we'll also be doing another event for the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences where we're going to be showcasing many of the new modules that are going to be coming out in September. So a sneak preview and just some of the things that you could be studying then as well. But thank you for coming along today. As Sophie says, any questions, email us studenthub@open.ac.uk. The chat room will be open for another half an hour. Please do talk to each other, and we hope to see you next week. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you for everyone who has participated in this event today. See you very soon.